A widow fought the flood for her son's life, but her rescuer was a man haunted by a fire. The rain fell without end, turning Hannah's small homestead into a drenched, isolated island of mud. The air was thick with foreboding primal fear and the heavy scent of wet earth. The river, once a friend, was now a brown, snarling beast, fixin' to swallow the world whole. Hannah worked with a fierce, silent resilience, lashing down the chicken coop door, her jaw set against the storm. She would not break. She would not be like him. Her husband hadn't just died. He had surrendered to this land, his spirit broken long before his body gave out. That memory was a spur driving her to fight for the small world she had left. Her boy Samuel watched from the cabin door, his face a pale moon of worry. That's when she heard it. A low, grinding roar that wasn't thunder. It grew louder, the sound of the world being torn apart. The flood was no longer rising. It was coming for them, a brown wall of fury coming on, hell-bent, ready to wipe her existence off the map. The rain was a thief. For 3 days it had stolen the world, replacing the vast sun-bleached sky with a low bruised ceiling of gray. It drew a shimmering curtain around Hannah's small homestead, cutting her and her son Samuel off from everything, until their world was nothing more than a tiny precarious island of mud and grit. The sound of it was a constant, maddening drum on the sod roof, a relentless rhythm that seemed to be counting down to something terrible. Hannah ignored it. She worked. With a grim, focused energy, she moved through the downpour, her jaw set, her worn dress soaked through. She lashed the chicken coop door shut with a length of rope, her knuckles raw from the wet cordage. She dragged the last of the winter feed onto the raised floor of the barn. Each task was a prayer. Each knot tied was an act of defiance. She would not be like Thomas. The memory of her husband was a ghost that haunted the edges of her vision. He had been a good man, a man of soft words and big dreams. But this land had scoured the dreams from him, leaving behind a hollowed-out man who saw failure in every dry spell and defeat in every hard frost. He had surrendered to this place long before it took his body. Hannah would not surrender. She would fight for every shingle, every fence post, every last inch of this life she had built. Ma Samuel's small voice came from the cabin doorway. He stood there, a boy of 7, with his father's wide, worried eyes, clutching a small wooden horse. "Is the river angry?" Hannah paused, pushing a stray strand of wet hair from her face. She forced a smile that felt brittle on her lips. "The river's just got a belly full of rain, little bird. It's showing off is all. It'll settle down." But it wasn't settling. It was rising. The familiar friendly murmur of the current had deepened into a low, guttural growl. The water, normally clear enough to see the smooth stones on its bed, was now a thick, churning brown, already beginning to swallow the roots of the willow tree at its edge. It was chewing away at the banks of her land. She finished her work outside and retreated into the relative dry of the cabin, the smell of damp wool and wood smoke a small comfort. She lit a lamp, though it was only midday, chasing away the oppressive gloom. "Let's move our things up," she said, her voice more brisk than she felt. "It'll be an adventure. We'll camp in the loft tonight." Together, they moved their meager treasures: a sack of flour, a side of bacon wrapped in cloth, her sewing box, and the small tin-plated locket that held a lock of Thomas's hair. Samuel carried his wooden horse as if it were the most precious cargo of all. They worked as the water crept closer, a silent, insidious predator. First it claimed the yard, then the bottom porch step, then the next. It was lapping at the cabin door when they heard it. It was not the sound of rain. It was not the growl of the river. It was a deep, grinding roar that came from far up the valley, a sound that seemed to vibrate up through the very floorboards of the cabin, through the soles of her feet and into her bones. It was the sound of the world being torn apart. Hannah froze, every muscle in her body going rigid. She had heard tales from old prospectors. tales of dry creek beds turning into raging monsters, tales of walls of water. Samuel's hand clutched at her dress, his small body trembling. "Ma, what's that noise?" All planning, all methodical preparation vanished. There was no more lashing down, no more moving supplies. There was only instinct, primal and absolute. Her only thought was Samuel. She scooped him up, his small limbs wrapping around her neck. "The roof," she gasped, her voice raw with a terror she could no longer hide. To the roof now. She scrambled up the ladder to the sleeping loft, dragging him with her. The roar was louder now, a physical presence that shook the small cabin to its foundations. She shoved open the small loft window, the rain lashing at her face. The roof was steep and slick with moss and rain. It was a terrifying, impossible climb. She pushed Samuel out first. "Hold on to the chimney, Sam. Hold on, and don't look back." She followed her boots, slipping her fingers, clawing at the rough-hewn shingles. She reached the peak of the roof, wrapping one arm around the stone chimney, and the other around her son, pressing his face into her shoulder. And then she looked. Down the valley where the river should have been, there was only a moving mountain of brown fury, a wall of water mud and entire trees churning and roaring as it came directly for them. It wasn't a river anymore. It was the end of the world, and it was here. There was no time to scream. The roar swallowed all other sound, a deafening, grinding cacophony that was not just heard, but felt a physical blow that vibrated up from the soles of Hannah's feet and into her teeth. The world dissolved into a blur of motion and violence, a sound like the world cracking open. The cabin beneath them shuddered a long, deep groan of tortured wood and stone. Hannah flattened her body against the roof, wrapping herself around Samuel, her own form a desperate living shield. "Hold on," she screamed, but her voice was a meaningless speck of dust in the hurricane of noise. She saw her life's work erased in a single brutal heartbeat. The chicken coop vanished, not washed away, but simply gone obliterated by a churning wave that carried a full-grown pine tree in its maw. The barn, which had stood for 50 years, sagged, groaned, and then imploded, its sturdy timbers snapping like twigs. The willow tree by the riverbank, the one she and Thomas had planted the day they arrived, the one whose branches held the memory of Samuel's first swing, was ripped from the earth, its roots exposed like pale, severed nerves before it too was swallowed by the brown torrent. It was a river of ruin, a churning viscous stew of mud, silt-uprooted trees, and the pale ghostly forms of drowned livestock. It was a hungry, merciless God, and it was consuming her world. Ma Samuel's cry was a thin, terrified needle against her ear. "Close your eyes, Samuel. Just hold on to me," she commanded, her own eyes wide with a horror she refused to voice. Then came a violent, wrenching lurch. The roof they were clinging to tore away from the rest of the shattered cabin with a final agonized scream of splitting wood. They were adrift, a tiny, precarious raft of ruin on an apocalyptic sea. The roof spun sickeningly, tossed about by currents that had the power of locomotives. One moment they were facing the obliterated homestead, the next they were staring at the unrecognizable watery expanse where the far pasture used to be. Hannah's world shrank to the size of her own hands. Her grip on the rough stone of the chimney was absolute, her knuckles white, her muscles screaming in protest. Her other arm was a band of iron around Samuel's small trembling body. He was her anchor. He was the only thing that was real in this churning hell. The memory of Thomas rose unbidden, his voice quiet and defeated after a failed crop. "This land asks too much, Hannah. It takes everything. Then I will give it everything," she thought, a fierce, silent vow against the roar. "But you will not take him." She felt Samuel's small hands clutching the back of her wet dress, his face buried in her shoulder. "Ma," he whispered, his voice muffled, "are we going to die?" Hannah looked out at the endless churning expanse of brown water, at the wreckage of her own life, and the lives of others floating by. She saw a baby's cradle empty, bobbing on the waves. She tasted despair cold and metallic as a gun barrel in her mouth. She tightened her grip on her son, a surge of pure animal defiance washing through her. She would not let this river have him. She would not. She pressed her lips to his wet hair, the lie a prayer, a promise, a declaration of war. "No, little bird," she said, her voice raw but steady. "I won't let us." But as their flimsy raft was swept further and further downstream into a landscape that no longer held any familiar landmarks, into a world made entirely of water and sky and the relentless, deafening roar, she knew she was making a promise she had no power to keep. They were a speck of wreckage in a river of destruction, and as far as the eye could see, there was nothing but the churning, merciless water. Time ceased to be measured in hours. It was measured in the agonizing rise and fall of their flimsy raft. The world had become a slurry of gray water and gray sky, and Hannah and Samuel were the last living things in it. The initial heart-stopping terror of the deluge had subsided, leaving behind a cold, leaden exhaustion that was in its own way more dangerous. Despair was a patient predator, and it circled them now in the churning water. Samuel had cried himself to sleep, his small limp body a heavy weight in Hannah's arms. She held him, her muscles screaming, her body a rigid shield against the cold and the spray. She watched pieces of other lives float by, a splintered rocking chair, a child's doll with a missing eye, a farmer's hat spinning in an eddy. Each item was a silent testament to another family's ruin, another world erased. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. The promise she had made to her son, "I won't let us die," felt like a bitter lie on her tongue. The river was immense, and she was so very, very small. Her gaze scanned the horizon, a flat, unbroken line of water meeting sky. There was nothing, nothing at all. Miles downstream, another survivor fought the same river but on his own terms. Ford, captain and sole occupant of the Wandering Heart, stood at the wheel of his sternwheeler, his face a mask of grim concentration. The boat, a relic of a bygone era, groaned and shuddered as he wrestled it through the debris-choked current, its steam engine chugging out a defiant, rhythmic heartbeat against the river's chaotic roar. Ford was not running from the flood. He was chasing it. He was a man hollowed out by a different kind of disaster. A fire years ago had claimed his wife, his daughter, his life. All that was left was this boat and a cynical heart shielded by a wall of deliberate indifference. He had learned the world's hardest lesson: it did not care. It gave and it took with a gambler's cruel randomness. So he had stopped caring back. His only concern now was the cache of fine Kentucky whiskey barrels he had stashed in a dry cave upriver, a speculative investment he was now trying to salvage. It was his last score, his ticket out of this God-forsaken territory for good. "Just a little further, old girl," he muttered to the boat, his knuckles white on the worn wooden wheel. "Just a little more fight left in you." The river was a beast he knew intimately. He had navigated its moods and whims for 2 decades. But this was different. This was the river unbound, a rabid thing that had slipped its leash. He expertly steered the Wandering Heart around a floating mass of uprooted cottonwood trees, his eyes constantly scanning, reading the language of the currents, the telltale signs of a submerged obstacle. That's when he saw it, a flicker of unnatural shape against the brown torrent. At first he dismissed it as just another piece of a barn roof, more wreckage for the river to claim. But then he saw a flicker of movement. He lifted his spyglass, the brass cool against his eye, and focused. The world swam into view. A woman, her form a rigid line of defiance, was clinging to a crude chimney. In her arms she held a small child. The spyglass fell from his hand, clattering to the floor of the wheelhouse. No. The word was a visceral, involuntary rejection. A cold dread, colder than the floodwater, washed over him. He saw not a stranger, but the ghost of his own daughter, felt the phantom warmth of his wife's hand. The fire, the smoke, the screams, the memories he fought so hard to keep buried, now roared to the surface, more powerful than the flood itself. His hands moved on their own, turning the wheel, his every instinct screaming to get away, to pass by, to not get involved. Not my fight, the cynical part of his soul snarled. The river takes what it wants. You can't save them, you can't save anyone. You learned that already. From her raft of ruin, Hannah saw it. A dark shape, a smudge of impossible black smoke against the oppressive gray sky. Her heart seized. She blinked, certain her exhausted mind was creating phantoms. But the shape grew larger, clearer. It was a boat. A real boat, churning through the water, its paddle wheel a miraculous, churning heartbeat. Hope, a feeling so alien and terrifying she had forgotten its taste, surged through her with the force of a physical blow. It threatened to break the iron control that had kept her and Samuel alive. She wanted to scream, to wave, to cry out, but her throat was locked tight with a terrible fear. What if they didn't see her? What if they saw her and simply passed by? She watched her breath a prayer in her lungs as the impossible vessel grew closer. She could make out the figure of a man at the wheel. He had seen them. She was sure of it. He was close enough now that she could see him lift a spyglass. And then she saw the boat begin to turn its nose, angling away from them, preparing to pass. The hope that had surged so brilliantly moments before shattered into a million pieces. He was going to leave them. Of course he was. No sane man would risk his vessel in this debris-filled hell for two strangers. He was going to leave them to die. On the deck of the Wandering Heart, Ford cursed. He cursed the river, a beast he had once respected and now hated. He cursed the sky for its endless weeping gray. He cursed himself for his moment of weakness, for lifting the spyglass, for allowing the world's suffering back into the fortress of his heart. The woman's defiant posture, the small, huddled shape of the child, they were ghosts, and he had spent years learning how to outrun ghosts. He turned the wheel, the spokes smooth and familiar under his calloused hands. The boat began its slow, deliberate turn away from the wreckage. Not your fight, he told himself, the words a familiar, bitter catechism. The river takes what it wants. Let it have them. It was the creed that had kept him alive, the cold, hard logic that had allowed him to navigate the years since the fire had taken his own family, leaving him the sole survivor of a life that no longer existed. He was a man of cargo and contracts now, not of connections. But then across the churning water, carried on the wind, came a sound. It was not the roar of the flood or the groan of his engine. It was a child's cry, a thin, high, desperate wail that pierced the wall of his indifference like a white-hot needle. It was a sound he had not heard in 10 years, but one that lived in his bones in the hollow space where his own daughter's laughter used to be. The memory was not a gentle thing. It was a physical assault. The smell of smoke, the blistering heat, the final terrified cry of his own little girl. A sound he had been powerless to stop. His hands froze on the wheel. The boat drifted, caught between his command and the river's will. He had run from that fire. He had survived. But survival had felt like a curse, a lonely damnation. He looked back at the raft, at the mother shielding her son, and he saw not a stranger's problem, but a chance, a terrible, unwanted opportunity to answer a ghost that had screamed at him every night for a decade. He was being asked to do for them what he could not do for his own. "Damn you!" Ford snarled at the sky, at the ghosts, at himself. "Damn you all to hell!" He spun the wheel hard, the boat groaning in protest as he fought the current, turning its nose back toward the wreckage. He was no hero. He was a cynical, broken man making a choice he knew he would regret. But not making it was a thing he knew he could not live with. Hope was a cruel, sharp thing. When Hannah saw the riverboat turn, saw it begin to fight its way back towards them, the feeling that flooded her was so powerful it almost knocked her from her precarious perch. It was a terrifying, brilliant surge of light in the unending darkness. But the hope was immediately tempered by a new kind of fear. The boat was a savior, but it was also a monster of steam and iron and churning wood. Its massive paddle wheel churned the water into a violent froth, a vortex that could splinter their flimsy raft and pull them under in an instant. The man at the wheel was a master. Hannah watched in awe as he used the river's own power against it, angling the boat to create a small, relatively calm pocket of water alongside them. He fought the current, his body braced against the wheel, his face a mask of intense, brutal concentration. The boat was a living thing under his command, and he was forcing it to obey. He was close now, so close she could see the grim set of his jaw, the lines of exhaustion and grief etched around his eyes. "Woman," his voice boomed over the roar, a sound as powerful as the river itself. "Listen to me. I can only hold her steady for a moment. You throw the boy to me first. Do you hear? Throw her son?" The thought was a violation, a primal scream of protest in her soul. To let him go, to toss him across that churning brown water into the arms of a stranger. "Now," Ford roared, his voice cracking with the strain. "There's no other way. Throw him." Hannah looked at Samuel, his small face pale with terror. She looked at the grim, waiting man. She saw in his eyes not cruelty, but a terrible shared understanding of necessity. He was right. "It's all right, little bird," she whispered, her own voice a prayer. "You have to be brave now." She lifted her son. For a heartbreaking second he clung to her, his small fingers digging into her dress. "Don't let go, Ma. I'm right behind you," she lied, a sob catching in her throat. With all the strength she possessed, she tossed Samuel across the gap. The boy flew through the air, a small, terrified projectile. Ford released one hand from the wheel, his arm shooting out, his large hand enveloping the boy's small body, pulling him safely against his chest, before turning his attention immediately back to the battle with the river. "Your turn," he yelled. "Jump." Hannah didn't hesitate. She took a breath, pushed off from the sinking roof, and leaped into the air. Her fingers brushed against the wet iron railing of the boat. For a horrifying second she slipped, her body swinging out over the churning water. But then a hand rough as bark and strong as iron clamped down on her wrist, hauling her over the side. She collapsed onto the solid wet planks of the deck, gasping, shaking, and blessedly, miraculously alive. She scrambled to Samuel, pulling him into her arms, burying her face in his hair, oblivious to the chaos around them. The solid deck beneath her felt like the most sacred ground in the world. She finally looked up at their savior. He had already turned his back to them, his entire being once again focused on wresting his vessel from the river's greedy grasp. "Get below," Ford growled, not looking at them. His voice was harsh, dismissive. "Out of the way." Hannah flinched at the coldness of his tone, but she did as she was told. She half-carried, half-dragged Samuel toward a hatch leading to the boat's lower deck. As she descended into the cramped, dark space, the roar of the river was muffled, replaced by the steady, groaning heartbeat of the engine. They had been saved from the flood, only to be delivered into the hands of a man who looked as broken and dangerous as the water itself. The belly of the wandering heart was a world of groaning wood, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the steam engine, and the smell of hot oil and river silt. It was loud and cramped, a dark, pulsing womb that shuddered with the effort of its fight against the chaos outside. But it was solid. It was safe. Hannah huddled on a pile of rough canvas sacks, her arms wrapped around the sleeping form of her son. The terror of the deluge had given way to a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, yet sleep refused to take her. Her mind was a torrent as wild as the river itself. They had been saved, an impossible, miraculous fact. But saved by whom? The man at the wheel was a phantom, a grim-faced stranger who had looked at them with something akin to anger, even as he performed his heroic act. She owed him everything, the warmth of Samuel's breath against her neck, the solid deck beneath her feet her very life. A debt so immense felt like its own kind of drowning. After what felt like an eternity, she could no longer bear the confinement. Leaving Samuel wrapped in a thick wool blanket, she climbed the narrow ladder back to the main deck. The world outside was a breathtaking panorama of destruction. The water stretched from horizon to horizon, a churning brown sea littered with the ghosts of a world that had existed only yesterday. Trees, rooftops, the pale bodies of livestock all swept along in the river's relentless, indifferent embrace. And at the center of it all stood Ford, his hands fused to the wheel, his posture an unyielding testament of man against nature. He was a part of the boat, an extension of its will to survive. She approached him cautiously, her bare feet cold on the wet planks. She held out the only thing she had managed to save besides her son, a small piece of dried salted beef wrapped in cloth. "You should eat," she said, her voice small against the engine's roar. He didn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the treacherous water ahead. "Not hungry." "You saved us," she pressed on, needing to say the words to make the moment real. "I don't know how to. I didn't do it for you." He cut in his voice a low growl of irritation. The boy cried out, "That's all. Now get back below deck. You're in the way." His words were a slap, a cold dismissal that sent a chill through her despite her gratitude. She retreated stung, but as she watched him, she saw the truth. His brusqueness wasn't cruelty. It was a shield. His eyes fixed on the river seemed to be seeing something else entirely, a different disaster, a different loss. This act of salvation was a torment to him, and she was the living proof of a memory he could not escape. Suddenly, the boat's engine sputtered. A deep, grinding shudder ran through the entire vessel. Ford cursed a single vicious word. Ahead of them, a new horror took shape. The wreckage had converged, forming a massive, tangled dam that stretched across the width of the river. The mangled remains of a railroad bridge, entire trees, and the collapsed structure of a large barn were woven together into an impassable wall of debris. The current, blocked and enraged, was forming a deadly whirlpool at its center. They were being pulled directly towards it. Ford spun the wheel, his muscles straining the boat, fighting to turn against the powerful suction. "Damn it all!" He roared, his eyes darting back and forth, searching for a way through, a way out. But there was none. They were trapped. Hannah's fear was a cold, sharp spike in her gut. But her farmer's eye, accustomed to reading the land and the water, saw something he had missed. To the far left, near the crumbling remains of a bluff, a narrow channel of faster-moving water cut a different path. It was a treacherous, needle-thin gap, but it was a gap. "There," she shouted, pointing, her voice cutting through his curses. "To the left. By the cliff, the current is moving through there." Ford shot her a look of pure, annoyed disbelief. He was the captain. He knew the river. "It's a fool's path. It's too narrow," he yelled back. "It's the only path we have." She screamed her desperation, giving her voice a new authority. "Look, the main current is pulling us into the jam. That one will pull us past it." He hesitated for only a second, his gaze flicking from her determined face to the narrow channel, then back to the rapidly approaching vortex. He made his choice. With another curse, he threw his entire weight into the wheel, turning the boat's nose toward the path Hannah had seen. The journey through the channel was a nightmare of inches. The side of the boat scraped against a submerged rock, the sound a horrifying screech of tortured metal. A massive tree branch, part of the jam, swung past the wheelhouse, missing Ford's head by a fraction. Hannah held her breath, her knuckles white as she gripped the railing. They were two people, a reluctant captain and a farmer's wife, fighting for their lives in a shared, terrifying dance. And then they were through. The boat burst out into a stretch of calmer open water, having slipped past the deadly trap. The engine's rhythm steadied. The roar of the whirlpool faded behind them. They were safe. For a long moment they both stood in silence, chests heaving, the adrenaline slowly receding. Ford leaned against the wheel, his arms trembling from the strain. He finally turned to look at Hannah, his expression stripped of its earlier anger. In his eyes, she saw a flicker of grudging, astonished respect. "Good eye," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. Hannah could only knot her throat too tight for words. The barrier between them, the one made of his grief and her fear, had not vanished. But it had cracked. The river was still a monster, and their journey was far from over. But for the first time since the deluge began, they were not just a man and a woman on a boat. They were survivors. Together. The river was still a monster, but its rage had softened to a deep, exhausted growl. The wandering heart chugged on a lone, stubborn pulse in a world washed clean of its sins and its creations. The tense silence between Hannah and Ford had changed the sharp edges of his grief, and her fear worn smooth by their shared ordeal. They were no longer a rescuer and a victim, but two souls adrift in the same boat, each having saved the other in ways that had no words. Samuel was awake now, sitting on the deck, his small wooden horse clutched in his hand. He watched the strange broken landscape glide by with a child's solemn curiosity, his earlier terror replaced by a quiet awe. Hannah watched him, her heart a painful, grateful ache in her chest. Then her gaze would drift back to Ford at the wheel. She no longer saw just a grim, angry man. She saw the profound skill in his hands, the deep knowledge of the water in his eyes, and the immense, lonely sorrow that radiated from him like a winter chill. It was Ford who spotted it first. "Land," he said, the single word, a low rumble. Hannah's head snapped up. Through the gray mist, she saw a high rocky bluff, its top green with pine trees that had escaped the flood's grasp. It was an island of life in a sea of death. Sanctuary. The sight of it, solid and real, was so overwhelming that her legs nearly gave out from sheer relief. Ford navigated the final stretch with a master's touch, guiding the boat into a small protected cove where the current was gentle. With a final sigh of steam, the engine went quiet. The sudden silence was vast, broken only by the lapping of water against the hull and the distant cry of a hawk. The journey was over. They disembarked onto the muddy shore, the solid ground beneath their feet a strange and welcome miracle. "I have nothing." Hannah began, her voice thick with emotion, as Ford unloaded a small crate of his own supplies. "To pay you with. The farm, the animals. It's all gone." Ford didn't look at her. He was watching Samuel, who had walked up to him, his small face tilted up in solemn contemplation. The boy held out his most prized possession, the small hand-carved wooden horse. For the boat ride, Samuel said, his voice clear and serious. Ford stared at the toy, his weathered face a mask of unreadable emotion. He looked from the wooden horse to the boy's trusting eyes. He looked at Hannah, her face streaked with grime, but her gaze full of a strength that shamed his own long-nursed cynicism. He looked out at the river, at his boat, the last relic of a life of running away. Slowly, he knelt down so his eyes were level with the boy's. "You keep your horse, son," Ford said, his voice rougher, huskier than before. He gently pushed the toy back into Samuel's hands. "You're going to need him." He stood up and looked at Hannah, and for the first time she saw the walls of his fortress crumble, revealing the broken, grieving man within. "The river took everything from me once before," he said quietly. "My wife, my girl. I figured the debt was paid." He gave a slow, weary shake of his head. "Reckon I was wrong." He managed a small, sad smile that was the most beautiful thing Hannah had ever seen. "Reckon it's paid now." He didn't get back on his boat. He stayed. He helped them gather driftwood, and with his skill he coaxed a small bright fire to life against the damp chill. As twilight fell, the three of them, the widow, the captain, and the child, sat together by the fire on their small patch of high ground, sharing a can of beans. They didn't speak of the past or the future. They simply shared the warmth, a tiny, fragile island of humanity against the vast, silent water. The river had taken everything, and in its wake it had left them each other.